Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. Before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about the Share the Arrows event. You've heard us talking about this, and for good reason. Share the Arrows is one of the most powerful women's events happening this year, and it's hosted by Blaze TV's own Allie Beth Stuckey. It's happening October 11th in Dallas, Texas, and it's where women in your life who have been craving real encouragement and biblical truth can get together. Your wife, your daughter, your sister, this is for her. It's a full day of worship, teaching, and powerful conversations. We all know how loud the culture can get, and this is a chance to push pause, learn in truth, and get recentered in purpose. Send someone you love or go yourself. Tickets and details are available at sharethearrows.com. And yes, some VIP options are still available. All right, guys. So you may have noticed that over the last few days, pretty much every show in in the news sphere has been about the Iran-Israel war. And this is not a breaking news channel. That's not really what we do here. There are many people who do that, and they do that well. And God bless them. They're definitely doing an important service. But in my view, a lot of times when you're trying to do accurate analysis, being right on top of the issue is really detrimental. It's very easy to get caught up in the emotion. It's very easy to have your understanding overridden by whatever event is currently getting splashed upon the news page. And most importantly, what is increasingly true is the information we're receiving is just changing constantly, often is false and immediately gets corrected or rewritten in real time. And this makes it very difficult to look at any given event and immediately give your analysis, because if you do, you're probably working on entirely incomplete or intentionally false information that really makes it difficult to get a real picture of what's going on. And again, that's not an accident. That's in many cases what the participants involved in the conflict want in the media sphere. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know now that the Iran-Israel conflict seems to be in a ceasefire for the moment. And joining me today is one of our favorite returning guests, Mr. Prudentialist. Thanks for coming on, man.
Thanks for having me on, Auron. It's always a pleasure.
So I guess we'll kind of start at the beginning. A few weeks ago, was the capacity of Iran to fire nuclear weapons at the U.S. something that we were particularly concerned at? I don't remember hearing anyone talking about the desperate need to get rid of Iran's nuclear capacity just a month ago, and yet now it is the most pressing issue facing all of America. Seems a little strange, no?
Partially, yeah. I mean, this feels a very deja vu moment because I recall in the 2016 election that many on the left and sort of the libertarian stripes are very concerned that Trump would be the war candidate, despite him openly campaigning on, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan being mistakes, and, criticizing George W. Bush and being a repudiation of Barack Obama. And even then, he had claimed himself to be the peace candidate in the 2024 election. And he had claimed in 2020 that he didn't start any new conflict. So, yeah, it seems very out of the blue because we were talking about everything from immigration and visas. And we were just on a few weeks ago talking about the Los Angeles riots and the very real ethnic fifth column that is attacking the United States. And then on a dime, we went to Iran has nuclear weapons capability. We must strike now. America must get involved.
And this is so frustrating because I think for the majority of Trump's supporters, they understand that, of course, international issues matter. We're not pretending, you certainly are not pretending that geopolitical issues don't matter. But they know that many of these geopolitical issues have been used to try to distract from the fact that especially Republicans are not delivering domestically. They'll talk a good game about immigration or these different issues, but ultimately very little gets done. And the only thing that consistently gets acted upon is the concerns of the international sphere rather than the domestic sphere. Again, not pretending that a nuclear weapon in Iran doesn't matter at all. Trump has been pretty staunchly against them having the ability, but we heard from Tulsi Gabbard in March that while Iran was enriching an unprecedented amount of uranium, that ultimately this was not a good thing, but there was no delivery mechanism, that the bomb was not in sight. There's no real functional weapons program. Now, I understand things can change. There might be better intelligence. But again, it feels like the timeline went from we don't have to worry about this for at least years to we have to worry about this immediately. And this comes right on the heels, as you point out, of the LA protests or full on immigration riots, the attempt by Democrats to obviously spread those across the country. It looked for a minute like we were really pushing towards a new summer of love along immigration grounds instead of George Floyd and police violence or whatever, those kind of things. And all of a sudden, this attack, has to happen. Israel launches this fight. Now, the timing is very interesting because, of course, a lot of people have pointed out that Netanyahu is in a very perilous place domestically. And that's really important to understand when we're looking at the nature of this conflict. This is a guy who has been in power for a long time, but has increasingly found his political future to be pretty dicey. I think if I heard correctly, he was just a few votes away from possibly losing power right before the strike occurred. And so in many ways, this feels a little bit like Caesar deciding he has to march because otherwise he's going to face criminal prosecution. This became Bibi Netanyahu's most important thing. And so for some reason, all of a sudden it became very important for America to be involved. But that feels like a very bad decision to take our eye off the ball domestically just because a guy in a different country is having domestic political issues.
Yeah, foreign policy for presidents has always historically been seen as the place to go to when things are not going well domestically or you don't have the political capital to push what we have. And I think that, for both Trump as well as Netanyahu, you kind of see some very different domestic political situations at home. I mean, for the United States Congress, we're on the 119th U.S. Congress, right? Only 5 pieces of legislation have been signed by the president. There's one more awaiting his signature, changing the Controlled Substances Act with regards to fentanyl. And we're still, of course, debating over this big, beautiful bill. And there's a lot of problems that are still inside that, especially with the Senate Judiciary striking a lot of the Enabling Act provisions that would allow us to bypass and step over these activist district court judges. And so that's on our end here. Then, of course, for Netanyahu, both prior to October 7th, 2023, you had widespread protests in his country for these judicial reforms that many left-wing Israeli pundits had claimed was going to entrench his political party and by extension Netanyahu into further political power. And then the recent loss or almost near loss of his government prior to the strikes in this ongoing conflict. And now the absolute banging of the drums and the rattling of sabers between these two nations. It feels very different from any sort of, strikes, even like when we had Trump in his first administration had killed General Soleimani. This seems very more recent and with a very concerted effort to get America involved. And of course, there's a very complicated relationship between these two countries. There's a very strong lobbying presence as well. And so it felt like for a lot of people, and this is again the problem with sort of trying to run punditry and coverage on the daily news cycle is because it feels like a relic of daytime television when you had 3 or 4 pundits that you could effectively rely on and information traveled slower. But now that we have Twitter and social media and Telegram and everything else like that, it's very difficult to stay stable or even have a coherent message on board when the details can change in literal seconds as new, videos and feed and claims from intelligence or other operatives will give you new information on the ground. So it's very hard for us to be able to really discern what's actually happening. And even now in the American, mainstream media, you've had these leaked intelligence reports that even the vice president, J.D. Vance, has had to come out and say that these were incomplete briefings. These were things that are not necessarily true, because the through line right now out of the Trump administration and the White House has been the strikes that the United States has conducted on Iranian nuclear facilities has destroyed Iran's capability of enriching weapons-grade fissile material. And others are saying, the mainstream media, that that's not really true, which to me sounds like this administration wants an out. It wants an off-ramp for negotiation or an off-ramp for peace, while there are those inside this government and those inside the establishment press that would really like to see this continue. So we're in a really perilous position in that regard, because getting effective, factual information from any party is almost all but impossible.
And that's why I made the Baudrillard reference for the thumbnail and the name of this. We don't have to, stick entirely in that frame. But famously, he wrote an essay about, the Gulf War did not take place. And one of the main points of that was that, yes, of course, there was a real conflict, but ultimately for most people who were involved, it was a hyperreal situation where they were not connected to the war. They didn't understand anything directly about the war. The war happened on television for the vast majority of people, and their understanding was built on television. And from the very beginning of this conflict, it felt like a war that was entirely manufactured to drive political opinion one way or the other. Public opinion was actually the main point of the war, not the strikes themselves. Because as you point out, originally, the original line that we heard from people who were involved in kind of encouraging this strike was, well, Israel can do it alone. You guys don't need to worry because Israel is capable of doing it alone. And, that's a relatively winning argument for me because I don't want to be involved in other people's wars, just in general. If you're a nation, a sovereign nation who feels that you have an existential threat from Iran, well, then I guess you need to make a decision, a cost benefit analysis of whether going to war is right for you. What I don't need is to be dragged into this. And so originally, when the selling point was, well, Israel's going to do this by itself, you don't need to worry about it. Okay, great. But we all had that feeling, many of us have seen this movie before, that perhaps that would not be the end of it. So the original stance, I think, for many people in the new right, the MAGA right, whatever you want to call it, was fine. Israel can do what it needs to. Don't come to us, right? That's what we want to hear. But please, let's be clear. We are not interested in any getting involved. We're not interested in regime change, any of this stuff. Then the narrative shifted to, well, Israel can do most of it, but it needs this one specific weapon. And it's like, but does it? Like, I'm somewhat doubtful, but okay. Yeah, and all of a sudden we have the idea, okay, well, America is going to engage in limited strikes, right? It's going to only be involved in this one thing that only it can do, and otherwise we walk away. Then we start hearing, actually, no, regime change is the goal from guys like Ted Cruz and Lindsey Graham, Netanyahu himself. Make it explicit that actually, no, it's not about just getting rid of the nuclear capacity. It's not about just having America jump in for a minute. We are looking at regime change wars. And of course, regime change wars mean America because Israel simply does not have the geopolitical heft or the logistical ability or really the political will to occupy Iran and completely, spend generations transforming that nation. It simply doesn't exist. And so if you're saying regime change war, what you're saying is we're going to make a mess and we expect the United States to clean it up. And this is where I think a lot of Trump supporters really got very heated. You got guys like Bannon just running out, Tucker Carlson saying, we need to stop this. We know where this is going and it needs to stop now. And so there's just this constantly evolving understanding of what we were committing to, if we were committing to anything, whether we had even involved ourselves. This constant confusion was, I think, intentional for a number of people because they wanted to more or less sleepwalk the United States into this extended conflict. The good news is that for now, that seems to not be the case. But I think without that constant pressure from Trump's base, we might have seen something very different occur.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of been the great media spectacle out of the last week, 2 weeks or so, has been this conversation that feels like A/B testing, where how much influence does the media or the base have compared to those that are really interested in getting the United States dragged into another conflict in the Middle East. And I mean, for anyone, your age, Auron, or my age, like, well, there's this distinct, like, lifetime memory of American military intervention from the first Gulf War to Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, fighting ISIS, and now potentially this. And, there's been a lot of pushback from everyone, ranging from Tucker Carlson to leaks coming out saying that J.D. Vance was a prominent voice against intervening. How true that may be remains to be seen, other than trying to divide the internal coalition of Trump's, cabinet between his vice president, his defense secretary, secretary of state, and the rest. And then all on top of that, you've got, people like Lindsey Graham, cheering for joy as he tends to. I mean, we've seen an evolution of that great Holden blood feast meme that everyone likes to post of this ancient senator who just wants to see Iran bombed before he dies. And, so I'm sure that Holden blood feast can, die happy now that he's seen that. But for people like Lindsey Graham, there's been this great push for regime change. And, there's a lack of nuance here because even from there, you've had, fellow commentators go on saying like, well, we need to just trust the plan, so to speak, and let this go out. Don't panic or whatever. And these become these sort of thought terminating cliches that really prevent any sort of discussion from interrogating what is the quid pro quo behind this. You've now seen sort of this push now back towards the big beautiful bill. It seems that like the bloodthirsty interventionist types in the Senate might have gotten what they wanted, and now they can focus on trying to hammer out any domestic legislation at home. But even then, how much is Trump going to get out of this remains to be seen. And instead, we're kind of left watching this televised Baudrillardian spectacle about, well, what is actually going on? And just like what we saw at the beginning of the war between Russia and Ukraine, and really by extension the United States, that it's very easy to fool people with old footage or footage from video games. This doesn't even get into any sort of AI discussion. But I mean, at the start of the war in Ukraine in 2022, you had people reposting old footage from 2014. You had footage from Arma 3, a video game, and War Thunder that gotten people all confused. And even then, we're trying to find out how much of the footage that we're seeing out of Iran or out of Israel and Tel Aviv is to be accurate. And it leaves people kind of just left in this state of, well, we don't have really anything to do except watch, but because we can make money off of selling takes, or we can make money off of offering our commentary, or like anyone on any sort of political position, I can at least virtue signal, then that's all that we can really do. And I think that leaves us sort of stuck fighting each other on sort of the timeline, so to speak, without ever interrogating what's actually going on. And this is why, trying to go fact by fact or blow by blow can be very difficult, because all of a sudden we really don't know what's going on. The broad strokes of it all, as has been confirmed by people like Pat Buchanan when he was writing about this, where the right went wrong in 2004, is that, you do have a heavy interventionist element. The Republican base, the Republican establishment has no desire to listen to sort of the MAGA base that voted for Trump, and not really Republicans. And you can see that when we see the approval figures between Congress and the White House. And we can see this between various politicians and compared to the president and the Republican Party. And so now we're in this really strange position where we don't really have the fullest extent of what's going on, but we do know that the usual actors are on board trying to derail any sort of conservative or MAGA or whatever you want to call it, push to focus on the domestic. And instead, we're really concerned that like all of Trump's political capital or momentum may be wasted or spent entirely on a conflict in the Middle East that has yet to show what damage it can really have on the United States, other than because of our relationship to Israel in the Middle East.
Yeah, and that's so important, because I want people to understand. Obviously, the Iranian regime is bad. There's no question here. They obviously hate us, chant death to America. They're an enemy. Like that's not a question. The question is, how dangerous is that enemy to me, right? Order of operations. What do I need to deal with first? The truth is that Iran is a threat to Israel, because if it builds a bomb, Israel is the only country it can really get to. It's not getting to the United States. That's just not happening. There's not a direct threat. That doesn't mean that I want Iran to have a bomb. Of course I don't. But that means that if I have to order the priorities that I have, then I'm going to put the current domestic invasion of the United States, the existential threat that is mass immigration, the one that is transforming the demographics, transforming the culture, threatening the entire political system, the existence of my country, one that has not been dealt with in generations. And this is the first time in a very long time that I've had a president willing to talk about and take action on that issue. That's the one I'm going to prioritize. It doesn't mean that Iran doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that I don't want Trump to think about what Iran's doing, keep an eye on Iran. But for people who are saying, oh, can't we chew gum and walk at the same time? No, actually, we literally can't. Like we have failed both to walk and chew gum, like independently. We cannot do them at the same time. We have neither controlled the Middle East or handled the domestic issues we have here. So if I need to order which one I'm going to deal with, I'm going to deal with the domestic issue first. And as you point out, my biggest concern with the Iran war was that if we get pulled into some kind of extended conflict, all of the momentum that Trump had built up. I mean, think about that first 100 days, how many amazing achievements he had pushed through, all the different things that he had went ahead and put forward that just no other president in my lifetime had ever gotten done. And then just having that just hit a brick wall with a new war would be terrible, especially as we're watching the left basically commit political suicide by having a race riot in the middle of LA with people, just waving Mexican flags and yelling La Raza, and they're yelling death to America basically in the United States. I care more about the people yelling death to America in the United States than I do halfway across the world. Doesn't mean I don't care about the people halfway across the world. Doesn't mean they can't ever be a threat. But again, if someone's yelling, I'm going to kill you right next to me, I'm more worried about that guy than the guy who's yelling, I'm going to kill you from Australia, right? There's just a more imminent threat, and it makes perfect sense to prioritize it. And it is very clear that if we got derailed, that was simply not going to happen. And and as you point out, Trump, very obviously, what he was looking for was another Soleimani situation, right? Get in, hit the target, walk away, claim victory, move on back to your domestic agenda. That's very clearly what Trump wanted to do. And you understand that desire. That makes sense in theory, but in practice, we have seen this play out many times, and we were understandably worried that that would not be sufficient. He would not be allowed to only do that much. And it was very clear after the strike that his resolve for this was being tested, because he's trying to basically tell Israel, okay, we're done, we're over, that's what we're going to do. But then we start getting these retaliatory strikes. Iran has to do one. It fires an American base, over in Qatar, but it warns the base that it's going to be fired at, more or less. They fire a bunch of weapons that are old, that are kind of meant to be shot down, more or less. No, they know Iran's not stupid. They know that drawing the United States in the war is exactly what Israel is hoping for. And so they're not going to hit that tripwire unless they absolutely have to. They might have the rhetoric of hating America, death to America, but in reality, they know if they strike America, they're toast, right? And so they're doing their best to not look entirely weak and entirely without a position to negotiate, but simultaneously recognizing that accelerating this is a problem. And then we hear there's a ceasefire, but then these countries are violating the ceasefire to the point where in the most Baudrillard moment ever, the president of the United States is literally screaming at Israel on social media to not fire its weapons and break the ceasefire. Like, it's, he's saying, oh, this plane is just going to go, they're just going to wave at the Iranians and it'll be fine. It's not a problem. But instead, Israel ignores the president. And, again, this guy who is directly responsible for pretty much backing their play completely ignores him in live on Twitter, and then just goes back to violating a ceasefire. Again, just creating that hyperreal moment of where is this war actually being fought? Is it being fought on social media? Is it being fought in real life? Because it seems pretty consequential that our greatest ally completely ignores the president of the United States when he says, don't break the ceasefire. I mean, if you can't trust a nation to abide by a ceasefire you negotiate on their behalf, then kind of what are you doing involving yourself with that country?
Yeah, and the other thing really too to consider here is that are either nation, I mean specific, let's go with just Israel and the United States, are either of these two nations in a position to be engaged in a long-term protracted conflict? I mean, the answer to that is going to be no, because there has been a renewed emphasis on the ability to produce our interceptors, our missiles, our ability to stop drones and other things trying to attack American or Israeli targets. And because any sort of protracted conflict means that the United States or Israel are going to run out of ammunition very quickly, it gives Trump sort of the emphasis to go very public and look for an off-ramp out of that. The concern about American manufacturing, especially when it comes to defense, has been sort of this undercurrent about our logistics, our ability to manufacture munitions, as well as staying on top of our THAAD, as well as other interceptor capabilities that we have when it comes to ballistic missiles, especially as Iran touts, and I know it's partnered with nations like Russia or China that have been testing hypersonic missile capabilities, whether or not they've been using them, and there's been significant evidence to point that the Iranians have been using hypersonic missiles in their strikes against Tel Aviv. There's some things that you can't intercept with the current technology that we have deployed, or that they're using older systems that may not be as effective against newer forms of technology. So I think that Trump has been very clear in making all sorts of public statements that he's not going to want to look for a long-term regime change kind of conflict. And he has been very playful with this to some extent. And I say that in sort of quotations because it leaves a lot of strategic and diplomatic ambiguity in the air when you get public statements where, I mean, Trump had said just a couple of days ago about, I don't want to say the word regime change, but like maybe leadership in Iran should change to make Iran great again. And then, he had come out and saying, like, we don't want to be involved long term. And according to the AP Newswire yesterday afternoon, Trump had told Israel's prime minister that not to expect more of America's offensive. They had come in, they had done their strikes with B-2 bombers, they have come home, it's a hero's welcome, and now we're going to look for an off-ramp. And someone had said it already clearly. I mean, Trump had very sort of been explosive when talking about the conflict, getting on to the helicopter off of the White House lawn where he had said, they don't know what the F they're doing. And I mean, like, you didn't see him that angry when he got shot, is what someone had said. And
Yeah.
I think that you haven't had a more honest, position right there. Trump just got up and shook his fist. He didn't look mad or pissed at all. He just had this moment of like divine intervention, so to speak. And then when dealing with a conflict halfway around the world with nations that don't like him and that he doesn't necessarily get along with, I know that Trump and Netanyahu don't have the world's best relationship. And then you finally get to see the president angry. And it's like, well, there's clearly something going on behind the scenes that we're not going to know. But sifting through the weeds of tweets and these influencer pushes has been crazy, because a lot of people have gone just so vehemently mask off, whether it's Lindsey Graham, cheering on the strikes like he's Senator Holden Bloodfeast, or more like Mark Levin on Fox News, who has just had a very large ordeal of civility on live television and on Twitter constantly for the last couple of days. And so it really just goes to illustrate that we don't really know everything that's going on. What does seem to be clear is that I think Trump and the administration know that getting involved in the Middle East and anything that sounds like regime change would be a betrayal of the consistency that he has always campaigned on, which has been not wanting to be in new wars, wanting to be seen as the peace president, and not wanting to get involved in long, protracted conflicts like we saw at the beginning of George W. Bush's administration. Now, at the same time, that doesn't mean that America has to ignore its national security or its, partnerships that it has with countries like Israel or others in Europe. But at the same time, and you had pointed this out as well after the strikes took place, Auron, that, we're still technically fighting a proxy war with the Russians in Ukraine. That's still going on. There's still this huge emphasis on this pivot to Asia when it comes to strengthening our partners like in Taiwan, in Japan, Australia, and India. And then on top of that, we're still having to deal with the ongoing crisis of immigration, intellectual property theft, and that we basically have domestic race riot / ethnic conflict breaking out in major metropolitan areas all across the country. Getting involved in a war that would require so much blood and treasure is not in America's best interest right now, simply because I don't think we have the capacity to do it long term, not without severely ignoring the greater existential threats that face America at home. And so I think Trump is very eager to look for some kind of off-ramp and say that this has been a success, we're going to negotiate, or we're going to find an off-ramp to talk about this. And as we can see from, anyone translating like Israeli tweets on Twitter right now, they're not happy about this either. And I'm sure the Iranians aren't either. But at the same time, I think Trump is looking very hard and fast to how do I get an off-ramp so the country can focus on my agenda, which is a domestic one.
Yeah, and you definitely hope that that's ultimately what he's, going to stick with. It's very clear, as you point out, that this is not making many Israelis or their allies happy. The goal was regime change. That was stated outright. That's what they were hoping for. And the fact that Trump is, it seems, willing to simply do the strike as advertised and walk away seems to ultimately counter the plan to kind of draw further in. And you can see this hostility. You pointed out, J.D. Vance is rumored to kind of be the voice of non-intervention in the administration closest to Trump. A number of news outlets have said he was kind of directly in opposition to other people inside the administration, arguing back against this. And you always wonder how much to take those things seriously. But the reason I kind of take it seriously is you look at, pundits who are big Israeli boosters, guys like Dave Raboy, talking about how he thinks that, Vance was responsible for like these intelligence leaks and he needs to go, basically. And he's obviously trying to drive a wedge between Vance and the rest of the administration because he thinks it's in the interests of Israel. And when you see people taking action like that, I think it probably adds some validity because they're taking it seriously. These people who are professionally involved and basically trying to move opinion in this direction are taking Vance as a serious threat to their agenda. And so I think it's probably reasonable to assume that's the case. And so when you have strong voices like Vance in the administration, the guy who clearly seems like the heir apparent in this moment, then that's pretty encouraging if that's really what's going on there. And you could see Vance, he came out as best he could there, trying to kind of walk the line between selling President Trump's initial strike, but assuring that nothing else would come out of it. Again, whether the nuclear program of Iran was truly decimated, or if only moderate damage was done, we'll probably not know for sure for a long time. But that is, at the very least, what the Trump administration wants to say. We were successful. We did what we were setting out to do. It's time to pivot back. And one of the ways that you can see, I think, that the administration is trying to do that is that over the last day or two, President Trump has been sharing a lot of immigration-focused posts on Truth Social, and those end up everywhere else, like Twitter. Actually, one of my tweets ended up recently in one of the ones that Trump sent out, where me and many other pundits were all talking about how you have an existential threat from mass immigration, and that mass deportations, very specifically, must take place. And so I think Trump recognizes that he thought he had to do this for whatever reason, to relieve international pressure, maybe to make deals with politicians in America to get the big beautiful bill passed. Many people have speculated that that was part of it, greasing the skids to get the budget bill done so he could move forward with his administration domestic agenda. But whatever he felt was necessary there, it's very clear that he understands that this cost him, I think, something with the base in general, and that it's time to move back. And I think the messaging has shifted back to that arena for a reason, and he's hoping that ultimately, one way or another, he's done with this conflict.
Yeah, and I think that that's really the emphasis, is to now have this almost about face. Now that this international pressure has been done, I think that he's gotten a lot of his administration to sort of get on message. The director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, has come out and said, look, new intelligence confirms already what Trump has already said, that Iran nuclear facilities have been destroyed. If the Iranians choose to rebuild, they would have to rebuild all 3 of these facilities entirely, which would likely take years to do. And they've, again, made this very much that this is a media hit job on what the American military has already committed itself to. And now that it's done, it seems like there has been this renewed push and renewed pressure to drag America further back into it. And now, if you look at what Trump has been saying recently, it's been all about the recent news with the New York mayoral primary, with a young foreign-born candidate who is now an open communist who wants to quote unquote globalize the intifada. Like, everything there has put this renewed emphasis on, at home, the ongoing political coalition of wherever the Democrats are going in the future, and that immigration is the only issue. And again, even Stephen Miller, who is Jewish, had come out and not said a single thing about the entire conflict at all during the entire sort of hubbub on Twitter about whether or not America was going to get involved in another war in the Middle East. He remained steadfast on the only issue that matters for people like you and I, which is the existential threat of our demographics and our ongoing political struggle and strife at home here in the United States. And so I would like to see that return to messaging and form be the really only thing that we go forward and push on for now. This isn't to say that we can't be completely shut off from what's going on in the outside world. If American interests, whether it's shipping or oil or trade and logistics, are going to be threatened by ongoing actions in the Middle East, of course, America is going to have to respond. But there's that very fine line about what has to be walked here, which is pursuing America's interests abroad without necessarily, kneecapping itself or being beholden to those that really want you to fight a conflict on their behalf, even though they're a quite capable military power on their own. And so, yeah, there's been a renewed emphasis, like I mentioned earlier, and you had said it too, that they really want Vance to be isolated from the Trump administration and anyone that has been on that camp. There's been a huge amount of hatred towards people like Steve Bannon, people like J.D. Vance, and those that have very pushed this sort of anti-war, anti-interventionist position, which has been around since we had discussions about invading Iraq. I mean, like, the American Conservative as a publication and institution started as opposition to the war in Iraq in 2003. And I think that, even they themselves have been caught in the crossfire with all this as well, even though larger voices have pushed it. But like, there has always been an anti-interventionist right without clear goals or an end game here. And at least for us, it seems right now that Trump is looking for that off ramp to renew his focus on other parts of his agenda that speak to his base. Because after all, it's going to look terrible if nothing gets done at home outside of executive orders or posturing when the fundraising cycle and the campaign cycle for the 2026 midterms is right around the corner. That curse of democracy is going to kick in real soon, and I think Trump knows that he's got to get something done before that happens.
Well, and the other big thing is, look, the left has been in huge disarray, right? They don't know how to counter Trump's initial thrust. They're flailing all around. They couldn't find a narrative. They were obviously, they're spending all of their time saying, like, how do we get all these white guys who we spent the last 20 years telling them they were Satan? How do we get them to vote for us again? Like, they were very much lost in the wilderness. And the first thing that they latched onto were these like violent, foreign invasion immigration riots that were occurring in LA, which is just a giant losing issue for them. And so I trust me, I've looked at some of these guys. They definitely want to become the anti-war left again. The left abandoned that position during the Ukraine war because they're idiots and they will sell their souls instantaneously for the smallest, what they think is a political narrative advantage. And so they took this position that has always, I think, had some kind of organic root inside the United States in general, and said, well, actually, we're just going to discard that because it's not politically convenient for us to oppose war right now because Joe Biden was in power. And so they completely sold all their credibility out on the Ukraine war. And the right kind of learned a lesson there of saying, oh, actually, war is not always something we need to support. Actually, there are wars that are fought without any interest in the United States, without any interest in how that'll positively impact our country. And we don't need to be involving ourselves in that. And so, for a good while, the right was kind of opposing unnecessary conflict, not saying, we're not peaceniks, we're not, hippies, we're not, pacifists, none of these things. We're for a strong country, we're for a strong defense. But ultimately, we recognize that that has to be in America's interest. We're not just deploying the military to deploy the military. It doesn't make us strong just to go out and fight a war randomly. What matters is that that is spent on the interests of the American people. The blood and the treasure of Americans should go towards the well-being of Americans. And the left is desperately hoping to get back into this anti-war sentiment. And so providing them with an opportunity to be the anti-war party right before you get to the midterms is a failing position, I think, ultimately. And so there's a lot of attempts to drive the right one way or another. I will say there are a lot of just anti-war people who really overplayed their hand on this. Everything was going to be World War III. Russia's going to strike us. This is going to create a nuclear winter, all this stuff. And they looked silly on their end because they overcommitted to this idea that, this ideology itself is the issue. And I tried to explain this to libertarians and I immediately regretted it because the minute I said, hey, actually you should oppose wars because they're bad for America, not because you're just against war as a general idea. War is part of human reality. It's part of human nature. It's going to be there. We are going to have to fight wars at some point. There are just wars we can involve ourselves in. So I'm not anti-war ideologically. I'm only pro-American. And so if the war defends America, if it's for America's true interests, then it might be worth fighting. But if it's not, I don't want to be involved with it. That was insufficient for, libertarians who are like, no, war is always the state against the people, these kind of things. And so I do think there's an ideological possession that can push you into bad places, as ideological possession pretty much always does. But I do think it's foolish to hand that position of, opposing unnecessary conflict back over to the left when that is something that was always core to the American position. And if you have any question about whether or not that was at the core of MAGA, you just look at Donald Trump's first farewell address, where he said that his ability to avoid foreign conflict was one of his proudest moments. If that doesn't tell you that that was part of the agenda, part of the understanding of what MAGA was, then I don't know what to say.
Yeah, and I think that that's sort of the important thing here is that the Dems are looking, the left in general are looking for some kind of avenue to make themselves appeal more. And if we look at the latest polling for down ballot races on, who's more likely to maintain control of the House, things have swung very far for Republicans, to a +4 degree, according to one of the later political reports I was just reading yesterday about this. There's a huge shift to where even, 15 years ago to today, things have had this 30-point shift to Republicans on the issue of immigration alone. I mean, there's still a lot that the Republican Party is terrible on, but at least the main issue about trying to control the border and to get these people out of here is, a resounding message that works very well. And to continue that message, I think will do well for them. But as for the left, whether it's this anti-war position or embracing the fact that what you could call it progressive woke, whatever, has become sort of the future of the Democratic Party, that, like you had said, they're struggling to have a system where, how do we have this coalition of various groups, ethnicities, and beliefs that are really only unified by their hatred of America, its heritage, its religion, and its people, to get the people that they have been kicking away from, which has been primarily young men. I mean, even the sex divide alone. I mean, like, all we've seen now is we've had Chuck Schumer, we've had Chris Murphy, these, what we would call establishment senators for the Democrats, and going out and congratulating the latest mayoral candidate, who's most likely going to be the next mayor of New York City, that had Wall Street overwhelmingly, vote for him. Despite going through his tweets, he's just like any sort of, progressive race communist that we've seen since the summer of Floyd and the Great Awakening. And so, like, you're in this really weird position where it's just like, well, the lines are drawn here. You can have competence and national security and an actual, push for something that looks like a civilization, or we can continue to rot the corpse and be the very thing that has led to the destruction of, the American nation, which has just been allowing these anti-civilizational entropic elements in, and then claiming that they're here on the side of good and the American values, and we're all here to make America great in our own respective progressive way. And we all know that leads to destruction. And so, I mean, it's good that, Trump has been looking for an off-ramp. Trump had just recently said at the NATO conference that there's really no need to negotiate with Iran or to pursue some new nuclear agreement because their facilities have been so effectively destroyed. Trump is very much trying to wash his hands of this and try and get back home and focus on a domestic agenda, which I pray is the case. But again, it puts both parties, and it puts our system in this really strange political position, because now all of a sudden we have to deal with the fact that it seems like the future of the Democrats is just going to be the ongoing demographic collapse of the country, and they're cheering for it, and that they know it. And it seems like Trump, or at least Stephen Miller at the very least, knows that that's what the game here is being played, and that has to be stopped.
Yeah, and I'm very happy, as you say, that Trump is looking for that off-ramp. It's obvious that even if he talked himself into this idea that he could just do this strike and walk away and that would be fine, his very visceral frustration, as you point out, with him, yelling profanity about the people he's trying to negotiate with, the fact that he's screaming on social media with a country he's supposed to be allies with and has already negotiated with to stop breaking those agreements. If you don't learn a lesson from that, you don't learn a lesson from anything, right? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, it's shame on me. And I think Trump is recognizing that if he puts himself in a position where he's reliant on people who he can't control, who have another nation's interests at heart, who are not going to be working for the good of the American people, then he's putting himself in a position where he can very easily get sidetracked or completely wiped out in this administration. And I think he knows his legacy is on the line here. This is a guy who literally got shot at to try to, get him out of the presidency. He knows the stakes. And so I don't think he's going to waste his time investing deeply in a country that absolutely seems willing to betray him after negotiations. And so whether or not the Iran's capacity has been decimated, it's time to look back in. Again, they were never probably a threat to America directly anyway. And so there's no reason to continue to involve yourself. We are in a cycle, a weird cycle now, where we recognize, and I think pretty much everyone recognizes, that nuclear weapons are sovereignty in the current paradigm. Russia, North Korea, there's a reason these countries don't get into direct hot conflicts the way that Iran does, because before you have the bomb, you're fair game, and after you have the bomb, you're respected, and you have to care. All of a sudden, the international community has to care about your sovereignty and what you do. Libya, gives up its nuclear weapons, and all of a sudden, it's open to regime change and becomes a slave market in the middle of North Africa again. And so you have this moment where I think people recognize that you can say whatever you want to Iran, you can make all the deals you want with Iran, but ultimately Iran can just look at revealed preference and recognized that the way the game is played is you get weapons. That's what gives you sovereignty. So they're not going to stop. You can throw as many bombs as you want. You can change all the regimes you want. But unless you're literally going to go in and occupy that nation for generations, whoever's in that nation is going to start building a bomb the minute you walk away. And so we're kind of in this moment where it's more or less, well, we kind of go in and blow up everything Iran is using to make a nuclear weapon once every 5 to 10 years. And that's more or less the solution. And as unfortunate as that paradigm might be, I think it's the one we're kind of in geopolitically at the moment. And with that reality, you kind of recognize, well, you strike and then move on. And again, unless you're Israel and regime changes your entire goal, you topple the ability for them to have the bomb, and then you just return back. You kind of cut the grass every 5 years. That seems to be the strategy going forward.
Yeah, I mean, this has been the long-standing debate in sort of in the academic international relations realm. I mean, there was a great book that came out in the late 1990s, before Kenneth Waltz had passed away, and it was called, The Spread of Nuclear Weapons: Debate Renewed. And it was right after one of the first major conflicts between India and Pakistan in the 1990s, and it was this huge debate about the realism about nuclear proliferation, if it would make nations safer, if it would decrease the likelihood of war. And all the debates had ranged around, well, like, are we going to see more catastrophic events like we have seen in the past when it comes to interventionism, or are we going to see sort of these very limited conflicts, because now that you have nuclear weapons, like, the likelihood of conventional war and escalation kind of decreases. And I mean, those debates are definitely well worth looking back on. I mean, this book is about 30 years old at this point, but even now, as we look at it, Iran kind of realizes that, okay, North Korea gets treated differently because it has nuclear weapons. Every nuclear armed state, from Israel to the United States, to Britain, France, etc., are all treated differently because they have nuclear weapons. And yeah, I mean, that's going to be the ongoing pressure here, is that you can't really convince a power that feels threatened or sees a rival state with territorial ambition that has nuclear weapons on their doorstep, basically. They're probably going to pursue it, and it's going to be a thorn in the side of any president going forward, and as it has been for years. I mean, it's been our entire lifetime since, Netanyahu has told the United States that Iran has always been months or weeks or years away from building a nuclear weapon. And that is probably going to see that rhetoric continue, regardless of whoever succeeds Netanyahu. It is going to be something that the United States government will have to deal with until we find some way to decouple ourselves from that region entirely. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. So we're really stuck in this awkward position where these kind of pressures from allies or partners in the region, whatever you want to call them, it's going to be an issue going forward for years to come. And I don't think that it will stop Iran from pursuing it. And eventually it could lead to something. But so far, at least for this instance, and what we've talked about for the last hour or so, has been that for now, the American government under this administration really doesn't want to get involved any further than it has.
And again, that's the great news. As much as I had a lot of concerns, and I feel those concerns were validated by kind of the obvious attempts repeatedly to draw us further and further in than anyone really wanted. Ultimately, it does seem like Trump's commitment was to this strike and only this strike, and his attempts to broker any kind of peace between these two countries in the interim has frustrated him to the level where he probably recognizes that he just needs to extricate himself as quickly as possible, which was probably already the plan to some extent, but I think it only reinforces that. So hopefully that continues to be the case, and whether Israel and Iran ultimately hold to the current agreement, whether or not one of them breaks it, I hope that Trump continues down that road and recognizes that this is simply not America's conflict, and there's no reason to derail his domestic agenda for two countries that, frankly, ultimately aren't particularly interested in listening to him. They have their own battle. This was always their battle, and it should remain their battle, one that the United States simply should no longer play any role in. All right, guys, let's go to the questions of the people real quick. But before we do, Mr. Prudentialist, where should people find your great work?
People can find me on Twitter at Mr. Prudentialist or x.com, however you want to call it. I'm also on YouTube. Just look for the lovely amphibious profile picture that you guys are usually associate my face and my work with. I am currently going through and reviewing Charles Norris Cochrane's book on a show that I host called Do You Even Read? And we'll be finishing up that book this coming Monday on the 30th. I'm also the host of a show called The Digital Archipelago, which I host with a guest of the show, Gio Panicetti, up in Canada. And he's a good friend, and we cover all sorts of things from film, media, and digital culture. And primarily, that's what I cover alongside current events and sort of the way AI and our social media affects our politics and how we discuss things. That's why the Baudrillard reference was so welcomed here. But as always, Auron, I'm very thankful to be a guest on your program.
And it's always great having you. If for some reason you have not checked out the Prudentialist, of course, you should do so as soon as we're done here. How do we say it? Penultimo says, please, pretty please invite Molyneux on one day. So he's referencing Stefan Molyneux, who's recently kind of reemerged on the social media scene, came back to Twitter, and I've seen his, starting to put YouTube videos back up, these kind of things. I'll be honest. I remember Molyneux, and of course, he had a number of interesting takes early on. He was ahead of a lot of people on things. At the same time, I've also seen his stuff again popping up on Twitter, and I'm reminded that Molyneux is like this weird cultish guy who's like, don't ever discipline your children, and Christians are responsible for my abuse as a child because whatever. And it's kind of one of those like, oh yeah, everybody who's an atheist really just hates God because it reminds them of their dad type scenario. I'm sure ultimately that would be an interesting conversation, but I am reminded once again that Molyneux's quite a bit of a mixed bag. Michael Robertson says this is possible cope. Poster pushback affected Trump on this. Maybe kept us out of war. Maybe cope sometimes, but always chimp. I mean, I guess you can sit around and say, well, the posting never matters, and ultimately this is just you trying to sell yourself on your ability to influence the president. I would have a very hard time believing that, having watched just like basic events. Like, I hear you. I'm not suddenly like the biggest democracy fan or anything, but it's very clear that Donald Trump monitors the situation on social media and the general feedback that the administration is receiving, and adjusts accordingly. We've seen this on immigration, the carve outs when it comes to specific industries. These things were specifically rolled back because of the pushback. I like Trump, but ultimately, I think the thing that a lot of people said is correct. Trump's social media posting is basically a reflection of the last 5 people he's talked to. And so you want to be the last person he's talked to before he makes a decision. You might find that stupid. Okay, congratulations. Democracy is dumb. But also, that's kind of the world we're in. And if we have the ability to move Trump on immigration, I'm going to move him. If you don't like that, you think that's cope, that's fine. I'm going to keep trying to do it as much as possible because it's literally the only thing I have to work with. Again, it doesn't make me a big enthusiastic supporter of the democratic process, but it does mean that if you're going to hand me this thing and it seems to work on occasion in a pretty important way, I'm probably going to use it.
Yeah, never not use tools that have some kind of impact. I mean, even if you consider it cope or whatever, I do know that there are quite a few people that you and I are mutuals with that have been followed by or are currently followed by numerous people in the administration from the vice president onwards. They have some impact. So I mean, never unload your gun, so to speak.
I've been mutuals with Donald Trump Jr. and JD Vance for literally years. So it's not like I'm just like, oh, I wonder if anyone's monitoring the Twitter feed. Like, come on, guys. Like, at some point, you're coping. Blood-based here with a donation. Thank you very much, sir. Very much appreciate that. Mel Gibson, after 4 beers, says, sick of seeing these razor fist types smearing people like Tucker and other Israel skeptics for being rightfully unsure about Trump's actions. Look, I like Razor Fist. Ultimately, I enjoy his content. But I will say that there is again, a tedious amount of this on both sides. On one side, I see people saying, we're going to this global war. It's going to be World War III because got involved in Iran. I think that was an overstatement. There are also people saying anybody who doubts anything that Trump is doing is fool and an idiot, and you should never push back and trust in every scenario. I think that's foolish as well. I am a planned truster to the extent that I think ultimately Trump is playing a game at a higher level than many people and is our best option at the moment. But I'm also not a blind faith guy. I'm gonna say something is wrong when I think it's wrong. It doesn't, there. I think the balance is always push back on the idea, but don't attack the man, which is what I've done on a repeated basis. Trump saying something I think is probably informed by bad advisors. I'm going to push back on that, but I'm not going to attack him and say, "Oh, well, you're the worst person," and doing the Trump has to be impeached because he violated the War Powers Act. That's where things get stupid. That's probably most of what Razorfist is talking about, but I think ultimately it is foolish to say, "Oh, well, you just need to follow Trump and never say anything if you think a bad move is happening," because again, I think he obviously listens. I think that's very clear.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's very obvious, and it's something that people kind of might sound pretentious or whatever. It's just like, but Trump isn't, Jesus. Like I quote the Psalter all the time: "Trust not princes and the sons of men." But like, you don't have to hate the movement or the guy to a point where like you have to disavow him over one action. But clearly, like, you can push back, and I think that's a big part of the media ecosystem, or this big sort of, I guess, chimp out, as people like to say on Twitter over it, is that you can be critical without necessarily painting yourself into a rhetorical corner where you basically ghettoize yourself for your position. But at the same time, when a lot of us don't have the degree of influence that say Auron or other people may have, it's just how much of this is just impotently tweeting out into the void like a boomer yelling at his television, compared to, well, I'm going to start some crap because it helps me get internet points or clout or a couple of extra dollars in my Patreon or my, buy me a coffee or Venmo wallet or whatever. And I think it's just sort of important to understand, and I'm sure a lot of the people who are donating or listening know this, but like, Twitter can be a great place to get information and to get sort of these rhetorical, polemical engines moving and running to move the direction of the discourse. But at the same time, it can be full of the worst snake oil salesmen that are just looking for their own advancement. And it's a great place where nuance goes to die. So it's important to be careful.
Yeah, and I don't want to be a nuance bro. I don't want to be like, "Oh, dude, you got to have, it's all about the nuance. I'm the rational center." But at the same time, I've only been a professional political pundit for a few years, but in my experience, the thing that matters most is integrity, right? Like, you can be wrong as long as you're willing to admit that you're wrong, acknowledge the mistake, acknowledge where the error took place, and move forward. But you can't be as disingenuous. And if you're always selling a position because it's straight ideology, or because it plays to the crowd, or it's what's going to get you clicks, people are going to be able to figure it out. Not in the short term. There are people who make lots of money running from thing to thing for a certain amount of time, but they tend to burn out or lose credibility or become caricatures. And yeah, you can spend the rest of your life rah-rahing to that one specific section of the choir, but that's not a great existence. Most people don't really respect those people at the end of the day. And so just in my experience, that's the way to go. Again, not everybody has time to evaluate political pundits to that level, and nor should you spend a large amount of your life trying to figure that out. There are better things to do with your time, but that's just been my experience. Duke DeSell says, "Woke and the GA are dead. Long live CBDs and new technocratic world order." Am I missing what CBDCs are?
Oh, central digital bank currencies or something like that.
Yes. Gotcha. Yeah, no.
Some of that's certainly going to be pushed, but the technocracy has never gone away. It's always been this progressive thing that people on both sides are going to utilize, and only time will tell about how bad that gets.
Yeah, I don't think we're even getting rid of woke technocracy. No. I think you're just going to get the let me trigger James Lindsay here, dialectic between woke and non-woke technocracy. That's going to be the only thing that actually exists. Not a option to do anything else.
Your gay race communism will be on the blockchain unless some drastic changes happen.
That's right. Paladin YYZ says, "Having intelligent play-by-play analysis regarding the fog war is what happens when we let those that don't eat bacon steal all of our bacon." And then he also says, "I saw an article on how the Air India flight to London has caused an outbreak of Indians having a fear of flying to London. Serendipity is still the best proof of God." Let's see here. We've got Count Artha, which says, "Missed most of the stream. I've been busy all day. Is nothing ever still happening?" Well, glad you could at least join us near the end, sir. And of course, remember, all of these strings are available for playback on, Rumble and Odyssey and YouTube, along with the Blaze and your favorite podcast platform. But I would say there's a happening, but I do not think it was the World War happening that some people blew it out uh, to say it was.
I would
Friendly
agree.
says, if the law of mutually assured destruction prevents powers from launching their nukes, why would having nukes prevent them from going to war? Or why would having nukes prevent them? Sorry. If the law of mutually assured destruction prevents powers from launching their nukes, why would having nukes prevent them from going to war? Well, it literally doesn't. I think, as we saw from from the Pakistan and India exchange, right? I guess they didn't go to full blown war, so maybe it prevents a certain level of war. But obviously we're basically in a proxy war with Russia right now, and no one has launched any nukes. And so I think that there is a very strange substrata of war where, like, basically you can do this much war without triggering nuclear deterrence, but not no higher. So there's, I guess, nuclear deterrence sets a ceiling on the intensity of war, but does not prevent conflict overall. But Prudentialist, this is probably a better question for you.
Yeah, and I think the other thing really too to consider that, and this goes back to that these debates between Scott Sagan and Kenneth Waltz was, well, what are your capabilities to have second strike capability? What is the current rate or production of your nuclear arsenal? What does your government look like in terms of competence and diplomacy? These are things that all kind of get considered. And I mean, as Auron had pointed out, like, uh, you can only have so much war. And as we saw during the Biden administration, there were conversations that happened between the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and the Biden government alongside with the Ukrainians and the Russians. So when the Ukrainians did something that seemed like escalatory, there were always calls to Washington about, like, hey, did you authorize this? Did you approve it? In the same way that we've kind of watched Iran and America say, like, you people should evacuate before I bomb this place. And people like to reduce this to kayfabe or theater, but it's also sort of this strategic diplomatic out that people are giving themselves to avoid it. Like, conflict obviously has still happened. I mean, yes, nuclear weapons have maybe reduced some of the large scale conflicts that we had been grown worried about, maybe during the fears of the Cold War and all the World War III concern. But at the same time, we also have to seriously consider, well, what is Pakistan's second strike capability, or what would Iran's second strike capability look like? Because if you can't do it, and your attacks with nuclear weapons would just be inviting suicide because you can't intercept or retaliate, it kind of limits things. But at the same time, the biggest thing that, from what I've read and what I've witnessed, is that it's really concerning when governments, especially diplomats and security officials, stop talking to each other. And once those lines of communications are off, then the security dilemma gets really uneasy and really high. And that's when people get worried. But I think at the end of the day, when it comes to this stuff, Iran still wants to pursue a nuclear weapon, and they probably will, because they know that you get treated differently on the world stage once that happens.
K-Max McDonald says, is it fair to say Israel mostly took over American foreign policy when the Cold War ended? I don't feel it was quite as talked about until the 1990s, and George W. Bush, Pat Buchanan, and Ron Paul were its only critics then. Well, I wouldn't say its only critics. There were several others. Very notably, you had Russell Kirk, who got canceled for saying that some American politicians forget that the capital of America is not Tel Aviv. That said, I think America probably has had its own foreign policy interests, of course, and has acted in accordance with those. But it's undeniable, especially in this particular case, that Israel had a significant influence. Like I said, no one was talking about whether or not we needed to end Israel or Iran's nuclear capacity just a few weeks ago. That was not the focus of the government. It immediately became the focus. It became the focus for one singular reason: Israel launched an attack on Iran. You can feel that they were justified. You can say that that's the right thing to do. You can even say the United States should have been more concerned and involved with that. But what you can't do is say that the priority stack didn't get shuffled simply because Israel made a unilateral decision to make an attack on Iran. You can't call that not influence. Like, you can say the influence is good, you can say the influence is bad, but don't tell me that an issue that literally did not exist for the vast majority of Americans a couple weeks ago suddenly becomes the most important issue in the world because Israel takes action, and that has nothing to do with some level of influence with Israel. I think that's pretty obvious.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Auron, it wasn't just those two that had criticized about it. There is a laundry list of people who had been criticized for making very obvious observations about that kind of influence, from Sam Francis to the late and great Joe Sobran to, of course, Ron Paul and Pat Buchanan, who had gotten in trouble even when he talked about these things in 2011 and 2012 when he had put out his book about the suicide of a superpower. So I mean, yeah, clearly there's influence there. You can debate the value or the worth or how much influence that it has, but it is a certain faction that, or a certain degree of influence that has a very pro-interventionist faction in there. And I mean, you can see that from everyone from Lindsey Graham in the Senate to Randy Fine in the House of Representatives. It does clearly illustrate some of the problems that America has, not just with, say, like, the Israel foreign policy, but even inside other countries too, when it comes to, say, like Somalia with Ilhan Omar and others. Like, there is a fundamental problem. It's not just with, say, like Israeli influence. It is a blanket problem of dual citizens influencing the United States government.
Let's not forget that just a few weeks ago, the president of Mexico literally told her citizens in the United States to continue riots so that they could affect American or American domestic policy. So yeah, the Greater Mexico Doctrine, in which the literal president of that country recognizes that illegal immigrants are here to serve her interests, and she commands them to act on the behalf of her nation. Yeah, it's not just Israel having an effect on the United States. This is why, again, we go to Samuel Huntington talking about the influence that diasporas have. He points that Armenia is often called, the other Israel lobby because of its level of influence, because of the large Armenian diaspora in certain key cities in the United States. So that, whether it be Somalia or Mexico or Israel or Armenia or any of these nations, having a large population or an influential population in key areas of the United States is going to allow you to influence the United States, which is why a number of founding fathers warned us about special relationships with foreign countries, because this is exactly the incentive that it sets up. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Once again, I want to thank everybody for coming by. As always, it is a pleasure to talk with the Prudentialist, and you should be perusing his internet wares. If it's your first time on this channel, please make sure to subscribe on YouTube. Click the bell notification so you know when we go live. If you want to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast network. And if you want to support the show, remember, you can always sign up for the Blaze, or you can head over to Shop Blaze Media, click on the Auron MacIntyre collection, and pick up some merch for the show. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.